Good evening. I'm delighted that you're all here tonight for a conversation about evidence and storytelling and what is in the archives and what is not. You're in for a real treat. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, and then we'll turn it over to Mi'Jan. Dr.Mi'JanCelieTho-Baiz is a cultural leader, oral historian, and documentarian who works with communities across the themes of sovereignty, transformation, healing, and equity to honor the past, make meaning of their present, and vision-loving and liberated futures. One of Santa Fe, New Mexico's 2017 10 Who Made a Difference, and the University of San Francisco's 2018 Living the Mission Award recipient, Mi'JanCelie is the founder and directs the New Mexico Women of Color nonprofit leadership initiative at the Santa Fe Community Foundation, and she currently teaches at the Banff Centre. Previously, she designed and led the Steinem Initiative's public policy digital storytelling pilot at Smith College and served as visiting scholar at the Interdisciplinary Center for Innovative Theory and Empirics at Columbia University. She served as documentarian in residence at the Institute of American Indian Arts and recently keynoted at Stanford University's Culturally Responsive Pedagogy and the Arts Conference, as well as the Create Justice Forum at Carnegie Hall. Mi'Jan has recorded an oral history by Ken Gonzales-Day, Fletcher Jones Chair in Art and Professor of Art at Scripps College, focused on California BIPOC liberation. Ken Gonzales-Day is the Fletcher Jones Chair in Art and Professor of Art at Scripps College. Ken's interdisciplinary and conceptually grounded projects considers the history of photography, the construction of race, and the limits of representational systems ranging from the lynching photographs to museum displays. The Searching for California Hang Trees series offered a critical look at the legacies of landscape photography in the West, while his most recent project considers the sculptural depiction of race. Profiles began as an exploration of the influence of 18th century scientific thought on 21st century institutions, ranging from the museum to the prison. The series includes photographs from the sculpture and portrait bust collections of several major museums, including the J. Paul Getty Museum of Los Angeles, the Field Museum in Chicago, the Museum of Man in San Diego, l'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the Bode Museum in Berlin, Parc Sanssouci in Potsdam, the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, among others. I'd like you to welcome our special guest tonight, Dr. Mi'JanCelieTho-Baiz.
Thank you. I give thanks for, just this generous welcome. I'm going to make sure that my slides are going. Yes, they are. And the ability to be able to share space with you tonight. However, before I introduce myself and share some of my story and cultural work practices, I'd like to center our time with this quick sensory mindfulness meditation. It's an exercise that I learned from a therapist. I'm just going to tell on myself right now. It's how I settle my nervous system before I start recording any oral histories or before I start storytelling. And it helps me to tune in to the moment. So I'm inviting you to take this journey with me by starting with a comfortable position, just right where you are. I want you to start by just breathing even breaths. Allow some relaxing breaths to enter deeply and exhale fully. Now let's try to engage each of our 5 senses, one at a time. Let's focus on the present moment, and let's start by closing. If that's a little too much, then just lower your eyes, lower the gaze, and tune into our hearing. I want you to begin to relax and just notice all the sounds around you. Let's hold back any judgments we may have about the sounds circling around us. They're not good or bad, they just are. And remember to keep taking steady breaths while you're listening to my voice. Now let's silently name 5 things that we can hear. You can tell how long it takes me to actually hear the 5 things. Okay, let's open our eyes and begin to notice the colors, shapes, and textures of our surroundings. If we really look around, just about everything has color, variation, and texture that may go unnoticed. Take this all in and let's silently name 4 things that we can see. Now touch. Where did you place your hands when we first started this exercise? Notice the sensation of where your hands met something solid, like the fabric of your clothes or the surface of a bag. Notice the pressure of where your feet may touch the floor, the way that your toes may be wiggling. Silently name 3 things that you can feel. Okay, let's shift our concentration to notice the smells of our environment. Try closing or lowering your eyes again so that you can focus on the subtlest of smells. When you notice your attention wandering from your sense of smell, gently bring it back and silently name 2 things that you can smell. Finally, we're moving to taste. Just notice your tongue in your mouth and your breath as you exhale. Most of us have taste in our mouths at all times. Some of us may have had some tasty coffee, tea, or chai this afternoon, or maybe there was a little dinner that you had a bite before you came in. Silently name 1 thing that you can taste. And that's it. So, who am I? Okay, now that we're all tuned in, let me introduce you to me in the way that I learned how to introduce myself when I was documentarian in residence at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Over 2 or 3 years, I had the honor to spend time in classrooms, give artist talks, and share my practices in storytelling and story collecting with undergraduate students and faculty at the Institute. During that time, I noticed that each individual introduced themselves by linking themselves to their ancestral homeland, tied to their family and their home community, and they did all of this while speaking in their indigenous language. I could not, and I still cannot do that. At first, it brought up a lot of anger, grief, sadness, and I just stayed silent during those introductions. But can you honestly imagine being an invited guest and then being silent? Finally, a young person asked me, "Who are you? Who do you come from?" So the introduction that made the most sense to me at that time was, I am a descendant from stolen people who have lived and labored for free the majority of our time in the United States on stolen land. That's not an easy introduction because that's not an easy history, and it still is not an unrepaired, easy present day. While that remains true, I am able to tell you about the people who made me. It's my family's oldest heirloom and treasure, the story of who I come from on my paternal side. As a kid, I grew up hearing this one story about great-great-great-grandma Emma, the last slave in our family. The story about her hands is the one that got drilled into us as kids constantly. Grandma Emma was a slave. She learned how to read and write at a very young age, maybe 3 or 4 years old, because she was a bright girl. The slave master's wife needed a note carried to the next plantation over. Grandma Emma volunteered to carry the note to that plantation and read it. The slave master's wife, realizing that Grandma Emma could read and write, found a sharp, blunt object in the kitchen and tried to hammer off all of her fingers, permanently disfiguring her for the rest of her life in hopes that she would never write again. The moral of the story for me was that I was supposed to stay in school until I ran out of degree programs to complete. It's why we have so many generations of educators in my family. Ironically, though, it was not until I was in the last month of my doctor degree program, those last hard weeks of the defense and revisions, while I was simultaneously beginning a job as a first-time executive director of a small nonprofit. I was obviously, understandably, feeling very exhausted, and I called my dad to explain that I just did not have it in me to finish, that I was sorry, that I was too tired. That's when my dad said, "Mi'Jan, let me tell you the story about great-grandma Emma." And I was like, "My dude, I know the story about great-grandma Emma." He told me, "Just wait," and launched into the story about Grandma Emma's heart, not her hands. Grandma Emma got sold from that plantation in Alabama to the one in Mississippi, but before that happened, Grandpa Bradford fell in love with her. Over however much time, we don't know the details, Grandpa Bradford managed as a slave, mind you, to earn money enough to buy his freedom, walk from Alabama to Mississippi, buy her freedom, and both of them walked back home. I like to add, as a very important side note, knowing that love story would have drastically increased my odds in my love life much sooner. I might have told myself and believed very different things about being a free, smart woman, deserving of love and belonging, if I knew that my DNA was made up of such tremendousness. So, hello. My name is JanCelieTho-Biaz, and I clearly come from tenacity, freedom, and love. I write, collect, and share love letters for a living, in one way or another, and everything that I do stems from the people who love me, and in turn, I love. I also have this strong belief that who we come from can shape, positively and not so positively, what we do and why we do what we do. Which leads me to another one of my family's story within a story between me and my dad. Last year, I was commissioned by National Policy Institute to create a California statewide oral history, civic engagement, and public art project. As is the case in many of the projects that I design and lead, I learned some new things, and last year was no different. One of the best learnings related to my craft was this. One of the easiest ways for me to create very quick rapport between myself and my narrators is to share a story of my own related to one of the meatiest interview questions. Before I hit record, I would walk the narrators through each of the 5 questions. When I got to question number 5, which is about the concept of Sankofa bird, I would tell them my Sankofa story. That Sankofa is a bird with its beak that looks behind them, however the rest of their body is flying forward. This imagery describes the idea that there are times in life when we must go back and retrieve something of strong significance in order to move forward in right and good ways. In my case, about 5 years ago, I was doing an oral history collection with my dad because he is terminally ill and he has dementia, and I realized that our family's inherited stories would be lost forever, alongside his diminishing memory. I was trying to jog his memory about the time that I was a little girl, and I asked him what he did as a music therapist. Because it would be inappropriate to take a child to therapy session, he told me the story of being an intern while juggling a job and full-time school, and how one day he was working around the clock and it was hot and he didn't want his records. So if you're young, this might not make all the sense in the world, but just follow. He didn't want the records to warp in the car. He was living in a hot place. But also, he did not have enough time to go back home to retrieve his records. So he says to himself, I'm going to have to get a record from the break room at the mental health institution, and the only one that was laying around was a country western record. Side note, we absolutely do not listen to country western music in my family. However, he decides that he's going to have to take one for the team. He grabs the record from the break room, and he enters the room with his patient, who has not spoken aloud in any of the years since he's arrived. My dad puts the record on, the needle drops, and begins playing a particular track where my dad looks up and sees his patient crying uncontrollably. The patient begins to speak his first words in years. That was the song that was playing the day that he found his wife in bed with his brother and shot and killed them both. My dad turns to me, as a little girl, mind you, and says, "That's the power of music, and that's the power of art, and that's the power of music and art for healing." So fast forward to 5 years ago, me retelling the story to my dad, whose memories have faded away, and he says to me, "Thank you. I completely forgot that story and why I did what I did." In that strong moment, I realized just how important it is for me to be a story collector and a storyteller. How powerful my work can be, that I can bridge people back to their memories. Me bridging my dad to some of his memories is in the same vein as some of the gifts that he gave me as a child. I watched and benefited from his modeling of what it looks like to take a variety of chances with one's career, while also adamantly cheering me on with my own wild dreams from the front row. My dad was a creative genius. He was a metaphysical minister who I watched storytell every Sunday, a TV producer and radio host, which is how I wound up having a knack for being an interviewer, and he was an educator who his students really adored. Most importantly, he is how I learned the practice of pursuing one's own moonshot dreams, no matter how outlandish they may seem. In the late 70s, throughout the 80s and early 90s, people thought that metaphysical churches were cults and BIPOC network media leaders were isolated unicorns. You probably would have a kinder reception if you told your friends and family that you wanted to be an astronaut. So as a teenager, I had my own outlandish for a Black girl dream. I wanted to travel the world, so I started as an exchange student to Guayaquil, Ecuador. By the time that I was 20, my dreams took a detour, but I kept them closely guarded and well tended. I did not allow them to fade. I learned how to privately grow my dreams. Like my dad would always say, golden seeds get firmly planted into the soil and only shared publicly after they grow and bear fruit. This was his recipe for steering clear of the doubters of the world. In my dream detour years, I got really good at exploring the different strands of my moonshots, and I became curious about the spectrum of threaded expressions that I would later weave into a whole. I gave my dreams range. Fast forward to the pandemic, not the easiest or most certain stretches of time. However, I have this amazing, caring group of people in my life, a bona fide hype choir who never let me let myself down. I hesitated to make big plans for the last 6 years of my life because my dad's terminal illnesses, dementia, and need for care have been liminal at best. I don't remember how, but I think it was a conversation about my age and how the next decade is the last set of years before I retire, and one of my BFFs, a wise medical doctor, said, "Mi'Jan, this is the youngest you will be for the rest of your life. Don't wait to live." I kind of put that thought on the back burner, though, until my daughter, Indira, AKA Queen Eye, that's what we call her, turned to me as I dropped her off at college and said, "Mom, now's your time. No one else gets to jump the line, okay?" So in the spring of Queen Eye's freshman year, I took my first step out. I did my first artist residency in years. I spent 5 weeks at Poco a Poco brewing my big cultural worker dreams while I also learned how to romance my life. March and April at Poco was the stretch of time, place, and creative community that was home to me while I designed my 2022 California BIPOC Liberation Stories project. It was there in Oaxaca that I dreamed of the kinds of people I would story collect with and the open-ended story prompt questions that I would ask them. Questions like, where do you come from in California? Where were you born and what place grew you? Where does your family come from? And if you were not born here, how did you arrive? What's the story of how you come to labor for your people's liberation? As you kept growing, what was that like? What were you doing? Is there a person who inspired you to honor your community's people and their labor for liberation? Who is that person? What is that story? When you have found yourself building solidarity across race and ethnicity, do you have a story that serves as guidance? And then that last question, that fifth question, there's a concept called Sankofa. What do you believe that you have had to go back to and retrieve in order to move forward in right and good ways? What is the story of the future that you are building? So I spent the remainder of 2022 listening to, trading stories with, and recording 20 people who told me their origin stories tied to their labor for love, kindness, sovereignty, and liberation. I was in heaven, and it really felt like I had arrived because this California BIPOC Liberation Project was my first time that I could claim being a full-time paid cultural worker with a whole lot of design time, collaboration, and creative freedom. As much as this was a turning point, I also emerged from that year completely spent. However, spring 2022 Mi'Jan had given winter Mi'Jan a gift. I had accepted the invitation from Poco a Poco to return to my dreaming place for the January-February 2023 residency. My intention for my second residency in Oaxaca and that creative community space was to weave my different story practices together and bundle them into one of my Story Feast events dedicated to the theme of love at large, to begin to understand my work a bit more, deeper even, bundled up with understanding amor. Yes, I am a creative. Yes, I am a cultural worker. I've known that for a long while. However, something else shook loose when I stared directly at love. Through my practice, I now realize that I am a ritualist. I make rituals in story collecting bundles. That would have been enough profoundness in one season. However, I also found out that I have been selected to receive a Fulbright, and yesterday, I just got the Fulbright Board's full approval, returning me back to Guayaquil, Ecuador. And even though I do not fit into any, and I really promise I do not fit into any neat boxes, I have never been a museum curator or an academic professor. In early March, I was awarded a Mellon Foundation Fellowship appointment to study the archives of the story ancestor who taught us the importance of building our own worlds and the necessity of writing oneself into the stories of liberation. But I suppose that I'm the kind of right-sized person who is up for the challenge of building a bridge between hesitant BIPOC world builders and the archives. My central organizing thought is that Octavia Butler, i.e. the genius who gave us Parable of the Sower and Kindred and Wild Seed, among many other great works, can teach me how to make a bridge between my world builder narrators, whose materials we do not want to lose in the future, and the archives that historically have not had a track record of being sites of honor and belonging. This year, I began making a bridge where both of these groups can re-envision and remake archives inspired by the jazz funeral second line. And if you're not from New Orleans, the second line is a particular kind of public celebration that happens honoring the spirits that have recently passed over from the living into the realm of the ancestors. My 2023 gives me a lot to think about and consider, consequently. There's my cultural work projects and ritualist path, now firmly understood in stronger, coherent ways. And my kids. Both of my kids are chasing their dreams, and I couldn't be happier or more proud of them. Queen I is headed to study abroad in Europe for a year, and my son Isaiah has just become a professional bodybuilder. He did not get that from me, I have to say that. Also preparing to move back to Europe. My dad's memories continue to fade and fade and fade, while I continue to stoke the touch point fires into the expanse of his shifting mind, both of us doing our level best to fish for well-worn details of the dreams that he touched in his lifetime. Nowadays, I mostly try to remind him that his spirit, his smile, his life will always remain alive in me and his grandkids, even after his mind and body give way. This particular combination of great extremes, celebrations, grief, and wonder, comprise the stories that I tell, as well as the stories that I live, hear, and pass along, which means that 2023 is about as perfect of a year to finally spend a month in the contemplative walking pilgrimage, the Camino de Santiago. I'm still working out what I'm going to be contemplating each day of that month. However, I'm sure it will be a variation on the questions that I keep as my frequent navigation companions. They are my oral history prompt questions that I ask when I'm trying to figure out a very particular aspect of life. Oral history gives me a conveniently sly and compelling reason to ask incredibly talented and bright people to lend me and the public with the wisdom from their lives. And then there are the questions that I would like to share with you, mainly as an invitation to try on and reconsider well-worn queries. Since we are here in a place of learning and growth, I wonder if you've signed yourself up to learn you in general, and specifically how your craft intertwine. Have you also committed to knowing what grounds you in life and your practice, or regulates you and the work that you do, relaxes and soothes you as self, learner, and practitioner, energizes you in some ways on most days? Do you really understand what you truly hunger for, what you need right now, today, maybe tomorrow, and the worlds that you are hospicing, architecting, midwifing, and building? Are you loyal to your dreams? And when you realize that you've drifted, because that happens, how kind are you with yourself about that? And what about the next time that that happens? And the inevitable time after that? What's your inside, most secure voice able to tell you? Do your dreams and practices and learnings guide you into trustworthy ways of existing that allow you to experience a full range of textures, curiosity, solutions, softness, sovereignty, interdependence? Just as importantly, are you seeking and nurturing the kinds of relationships that model what my dad gifted me? Being front row champions to each other's dreams, practices, and lives, no matter how non-linear they may start out or unfold. And what kind of second lines will you dance and play in, honoring who and what has loved you the very most in your life and your practice once they have passed on? I'm grateful to have found my way to these questions because they've saved me. I really promise. They really have. They've saved me, they've saved my sanity and my creative practice more than once. Of course, I wish that I had found them in my 20s. That would have been way more convenient, but whatever. Even if I did not have all the right or precise ways to articulate them. These questions keep giving meaning and reframing me, my mind, my cultural work, and ritualist practices to my body, my voice, and my life. I'm also very grateful to the matchmakers, narrators, project commissioners, keynote inviters. All of y'all, in one way or another, keep encouraging me to write, collect, and read these love stories and love letters. Today, right now, I'm giving special thanks to the kind of people who show up to hear these particular love letters. That means that I'm clearly so very grateful to you, my listeners, and of course, Queen Isaiah, my son, my dad, for being that inspiration in the love letters. Bridges are curious things. They are like excellent stories, moving people across different directions of space and time. And so I'm thanking you for being one of my bridges and exceptional witnesses this season. Thank you. And I'll take a note just in case you ask me a wild question.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. So for those that may not have heard, I was the subject of one of these interviews over this. We hadn't met before. In fact, we met for the first time today in the back room there.
In person.
In person. We met in Zoom before
Yes.
and had been living in the Zoom life. And so it's just been wonderful a journey to go through. And you can imagine during the pandemic how isolating it was for many of us. And so to have basically a voice reach out from the internet, as it were, to sort of want to hear a story and to think about the questions she outlined for you. What is your point of inspiration? How do you locate yourself? How do you ground yourself? Were very meaningful questions, and they remain meaningful for many of us who are cultural producers of some kind. So my first question's really got to be, where can people listen to them, and what's the state of the project now, or where does it live?
Spotify. I created 5 different playlists, and I curated them based on themes. There is a poster that's going up in the library, and you can just scan the QR code. There are 4 public library sites that actually have. Oakland has CDs because it was just easier for them to hold the collection that way. And the next, to your question, what's next? So Policy Link is that National Policy Institute that commissioned the project. And so the whole impetus from the very beginning was, we don't need another white paper for policymakers, lawmakers to review. We need to hear the stories of liberation of BIPOC California folks. So that's the next. I turned all of the stories over, unedited, but also the playlist for the public, so that they can start to influence that change. Your story can help to influence that change.
Thank you. And the other thing I kept thinking of as you were talking was very much the idea of a kind of map making. You used a lot of language, sort of place markers that you come back to And I kept thinking of the archive as a kind of map. And so maybe you could talk a little bit, and I was thinking, what informs these things? Why would somebody create all of these different categories and remember them, right? Because she was so consistent at thinking about these locations. And what I was thinking was that, of course, it had to do with trauma, that there's something to do with the trauma of lived experience, the trauma of inherited experience, right? Or inherited trauma. And maybe you could unwind that for us a little bit, or maybe just give us a guide in terms of how you came up with that, how it works for you, how do you maintain it?
I think, that's interesting that you say that. I have several mentors. However, my oral history mentor and the person who taught me for a year after I received the formal training is the president of the Oral History Association and also the director at Columbia University, the only grad oral history program in the United States, Dr. Amy Starczewski. And one thing that she says about me and my practice is how oral historians can typically fall into this trauma-based work practice and that I don't. And I think it's because, to be honest, the first big project I landed, it was so hard that I wound up depressed afterwards. And I was like, and I had people tell me like, oh, you'll get thick skin and all of that. And I was like, I'm really not interested in that. Actually, I think my little heart needs something different. And so I just recognized there's this strong need. This is what's getting funded. However, what I want to do in my practice and for my own personal sanity and nervous system, I'm gonna only collect and design projects where I'm listening to people transcend the trauma. That's the only thing that I can do, because if I listen and record and amplify these trauma-based stories where people are still stuck there, and especially because I do whole community or regional projects, I was like, it's just too much. It's too much for me, and it's also not what I want to amplify. When I did my doc degree, I loved collecting the oral histories of massive cultural leaders who are solution bound. And I was like, let's amplify, we need that, more of that. So that's how I wound up here with that, and not stuck in the trauma.
Thank you, that's a wonderful story, of course. We will eventually open it up to you guys, so start thinking of your questions. I think, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Because I'm like, how was it for you, Ken? Like, what? Because we didn't talk after that until we met to talk about, how tonight would go. Yeah.
Yeah, so you heard some of the questions described, so it's exactly what it was like. She asked these questions, which I didn't know ahead of time.
No, that's wrong. I gave them to you. Don't listen to him.
Okay.
Do not.
But
avert your ears now.
So I didn't internalize what the questions were. I'm trying to remember back. That was a few months ago.
Yes.
So I wasn't really I guess I read the questions, but maybe I didn't know what they meant.
Yeah.
I didn't know what the framework was, because I don't come from that framework, right? So they didn't resonate for me in the way that they resonate when I hear you describe them and talk about them. So there's a little bit of the shock and the trauma and the fear when somebody's asking you to share something about your practice or your life's work. It's a vulnerability that normally I don't have to share, and I create work. I'm a visual artist, for those that aren't familiar. So I make artworks. The artworks go out in the world and they can be critiqued and explored and all of that, but I don't go out in the world. I stay in the studio, I stay in the classroom. And so it's very different. I don't think of myself as a public figure in the way that you are very active with people and very comfortable in that presence. So I was a little alarmed, with myself, trying to think of how to describe something, how to represent myself in a way that would do my ancestors right, as it were, and not to misrepresent. And it felt like maybe in a way, was I the right person to be answering these questions. So that was intense. And then once you started it, we did an exercise similar. Mm-hmm. And so that did help calm me down a little bit. And again, I'm sitting in my house looking at a screen. So it's not exactly like you have community in the way that you might have here, where I might come sit next to you and we'd be like, okay, let's go do this. So that took a lot of trust and you were able to open up that side of things. I think the story of your father, of course, is incredibly powerful. And we all think of our own relatives that we've lost or loved ones, and just thinking about the responsibility of those legacies. So I think that was really incredible. And then, of course, the question of whether one represents others or whether one has the right to maybe.
That's the thing that I've been trying to noodle and grow beyond. So many narrators last year said either no, but then they reconsidered and said yes, or expressed the trepidation because there was this sense that who are they to be the one to speak on behalf? And I'm like, I'm not asking you to speak on behalf, I'm asking you to share your practice. And so there's something that I have to figure out how to bridge so that folks feel very welcome and invited, not just into the process, but the invitation at large.
Which I think I got in the experience of it, of course. I was just thinking in terms of teaching, a lot of our students have a very difficult time finding their, there's a lot of pressures to produce work, there's a lot of pressures to succeed and to do well. They have a lot of pressures to the family, the college, their professors, their roommates. And so I also do see students that are hitting that wall, where, particularly coming out of the pandemic, where people were so isolated for so long. What kinds of, thoughts do you have for somebody that's very young, or how did you start out? Let's say it's 20 or 19, or what advice would you give?
Finding your people, always that, and starting with group projects where someone brings you in is a way easier entry point than needing to come up with the funding for the project and conceptualizing, designing, hitting those milestones with a big commissioning agent. I have a solid reputation. I will always, what do I say? I under-promise, over-deliver, under-budget ahead of time. And I do not recommend that work ethic. I do not. That said, I think it's important to connect with the people who you believe in their ethics, the work that they're doing, and how they're getting that work done. If it's burnout central, that's really easy to just U-turn right on out of that scenario.
Do you find that you write things down to make your lists? Are you a list maker?
Oh God, I'm a Capricorn, Ken, yes.
I'm sensing a lot of lists.
Yes, spreadsheets are my love language, yes.
And in a way, does that ability to abstract and to think of your experiences in little squares help to process some of that?
I think of projects in constellations based on people, and I start with the nucleus, and I'm like, what 4 people, 3 people have to be part of this project? And who knows these people? Who will tell them? Like Feng told you, I'm sure, you have to say yes, even though you did not have to say yes. But I find in addition to my nucleus of the narrators I find my matchmakers. And that was one of the most magical things of last year, was that the matchmakers were also some of the narrators. That doesn't always happen.
And how do you start? What's the kernel that gets you out of bed, that gets the project going? Because a lot of times the students have great ideas. They're amazing students. They have amazing ideas, but that first, how do you get started?
That's not my issue. Mine is the middle, where I'm like, why did I say that this was a good idea? This was a bad idea. You know what I mean? I have an issue with not the beginning, not the end. It's always the middle that feels, I think it doesn't have the kickstart, the momentum, the spark of the beginning, or the urgency of wanting to get it done ahead of time, or definitely by the proposed period of time. So it's those are the easy phases for me. The middle, that's when I just, eat cookies under the blanket of the bed.
And how do you know when a project is done?
Oh, that's hard. I don't. I don't. I'm not a good person with that, to be honest. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. Non-judgmentally, I will say, they wind up, for God's sake, I'm going back to Guayaquil, Ecuador, 32 years after I was an exchange student. Like, things just, they keep, doing these circles, and I keep saying yes, so.
You know, it sounds wonderful, and I think what's so amazing is your generosity with all of the histories and the stories and the questions that you're sharing with us. You know, I think many of us have expertise in something, but it's not that we don't always find that to be as exciting or as exciting as you make it sound. So, like, I think that's an incredibly generative thing and generous thing that you do, and I think maybe that's something that we try to do here at Scripps and with the community of scholars and students. And I wish there were more of my students here to learn about that. But there's so much about learning to take advantage of each other, to find each other's voices, to see the strength of community, you know, all around us, and to find strength in that is something that's very special about Scripps, and really something special about being back now, having been in Zoom for a little while. You know, there is a difference, and so I think that's an important part of it.
Agreed. Oral histories were different. I was grateful that I only did maybe half of last year's oral history recordings. People have, I always open it up in my mind. I don't articulate it. There could have been, some health concerns. I make sure every project is intergenerational. And so I wanted to be conscientious. Folks who had little ones at home and felt a little concerned about me coming to their home or an enclosed space, elders. So it felt a little wonky to me because I'm like, you don't know me. And I'm basically requiring, not asking, requiring that you trust me enough to open up and share your stories, not just in general, but recorded, knowing that they're going to be available in libraries, on the internet, and also used, maybe not that word, but utilized for policy purposes. That's a big ask, you know what I mean? And so I'm like, and through Zoom? But that's where the matchmakers are essential, yeah.
Thank you. I think it's a good time for some questions, if there are any.
Hi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes.
I'm pretty sure you could have heard me without the mic. I just, wanted to be respectful. You were making your way all the way over here to get me. My name is Jaspa, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I really honor your work. I think, there's a select people that are put on this earth to remind everybody else that they're spirits and that, they deserve to be paying attention and answering these questions for themselves with the help of other healers, such as yourself. So I see that and I feel that, and I just thank you for being here and sharing your work. Speaking of full circles, I dropped out from these schools in 2017, and I'm back this year to finish. Woo! And I'm just like, and my partner is actually from Guayaquil, Ecuador, so I feel like, you know what I mean? When you're just sitting in a place and you were supposed to be here, and it wasn't planned. Yeah. So, yes, I want to say shout out to those moments, and anytime you may have experienced those in your life that has led you here to this moment. But my question is, what are some boundaries, whether yours, that you keep for yourself or that you demand of others in your presence, that have really kept you in your body to continue doing this work? That's my question.
I'm going to think about this for a second, because it's taken, like that exercise, it seems like an odd thing to talk about one's creative practice and therapy consistently, but I was just noticing how squishy, like I said, that first project, I think it would be fine to say, it was the Gloria Steinem Initiative at Smith College. Actually, that was the second project. And I recorded the founder of the Prison Birth Project, her story, and listening to how they successfully passed a law so that women who are incarcerated or people who are incarcerated birthing would not be shackled. And to have to, just gave me the chills again, to have to, because when I edit, you have to hear it again and again and again just to get it to the right stop point and fade in, fade out and all that. And I was like, this is horrible. What's happening in this country, this sliver of it, this is horrible. Me listening to this for weeks on end, horrible, and also very needed and great. And I was like, I'm gonna have to figure out how to reconcile this because I am too porous. And it just, had me really messed up. And so you heard me say, like, I made a firm decision, and that's how I wound up getting hired and commissioned for all of these projects, because people know that if there's somebody who is going to do stories of transformation justice, folks have me to the ends of time for that. Trauma, listening to that again and again, and before the pandemic, I was one of those interviewers where I would be like almost in Ken's lap, like this close, taking notes. And so to listen to trauma for hours, I think your interview, we probably visited maybe all in an hour, but for like Emory Douglas, I was at his house for half a day. I just wind up absorbing, which is a positive, healing, beautiful thing when they are the stories of transformation. When it's the story of how life, colonization in its myriad ways of expressions, has beaten people down, that is not a good place for me to reside. So I haven't, in terms of my body, arrived to a practice other than that therapist who was like, let's get you into your body. Because I can say the difference between me as a story collector and me as a storyteller, it started at Columbia University. I gave an artist talk and I had an out-of-body experience. And it's like so weird. I thought it was this woman who was in the audience, and I was like, she put a root on me. That's why that happened. And it was not, like, she was a lovely person. But I kept having those experiences, even at Carnegie Hall, in front of hundreds of people, and it felt horrible, horrible, horrible. Everybody is an adult here, so I can say this. I went to healers to ask. I went to midwives. Living in New Mexico, I have access to so many amazing traditional folk healers, curanderas, as well as from the pueblos, the indigenous communities. And some people would say, like, well, do you want us to make a bundle for you? Or because I was like, I got to do something where I'm back in my body. And none of it worked. It just didn't work for me. And I stopped doing artist talks. I stopped writing love letters and sharing them because I was like, this is nerve-wracking. I would hit the stage, say my first things, and I would not have any recollection of anything until the last minute where somebody would be like, okay, we're at time now. And so it all ended when I just happened to meet this burlesque dancer teacher lady. And she was like, you are speaking to, you will notice when I do these readings, I go very slowly so that I stay in my body. She was like, you're running through stuff so fast and you don't have a dimmer switch. That Stanford talk I did, there were like 300 people in the hall and I could feel every single person because I'm empathic too. And I was like, this is chaos. This is not, I don't think, like necessary for me to be a good practitioner. So the burlesque dancer, she was like, I want you to do a body scan and I want you to go slowly. Listen to your own voice. Yes, you're connecting with people, but I connect one at a time, not like the whole room. They're just different techniques. That was a long, convoluted way of telling you.
Other questions? I'm sure there are.
I know, now that I told you about the burlesque dancer teacher lady, I'm like,
I mean, what more do you need? We've got it all. I was wondering if you could describe what the out-of-body experience felt like. Like, I'm just trying to understand it.
I can go back to that first one. I remember Dr. Amy Starczewski, like seeing her, and she's like beaming and smiling. I remember looking at the clock in the back of the hall, and I had at that point I wasn't writing love letters. That's another thing that keeps me in my body, is to be able to connect to the page, connect to people. It's like two strong touch points that help. And at that point, I was just talking, and I had a notebook, and I had like bullet points, Capricorn, bullet points. And I remember looking at one bullet point, and then I remembered like heat, you know what I mean? Like feeling hot in my cheeks and my body. And the next thing I remember was applause, people are standing, and I'm like, what the heck? There's 1 minute left to this program? Where did I just go? What is this? And then freaking out, everybody's like, oh, this is great. And I'm like, oh my God, can I go hide under a table? Like, this is horrible. Because I had never felt that way before, so.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. I really appreciate your style of presentation. At first, I was looking for something very linear, and I'm like, put the paper down, this is not that. But you have opened up for me. I have a friend who is from Mexico, and her mom has had the most amazing life that I have heard. She's a strong woman, very strong spiritually. She has been broken in so many ways and from so many life traumas, and yet she's risen again above it. And young people walk down the street and they greet her warmly and will hug her. When youth from all races in East LA, and it's like she has no fear. She just keeps moving forward. So now she's getting to the place where short-term memory is affected, and her daughters are so caught up in the care and the burden of care that they are not appreciating all that is coming out of her mouth. And it's like every time I walk in her place, it's like she doesn't hold back. She just spills, all these wonderful stories, and she creates songs. She sings horribly, but she creates lyrics and prayers, and I'm like, why me? It's like, maybe I keep trying to get her daughters to record these stories. They're too caught up in the care and the anger at seeing their mother diminish. But I feel like it's not my story to tell. I feel like it would be tainted or something. It's got to come from them. But maybe I can help push it along the way.
Yeah, or be a companion in the process, right? It doesn't have to be a either or. You could be beside.
Maybe you could use that as a way to help share how to get started if people want to collect a story.
Oh,
how do they start? Where do you begin?
Two great resources. One, so the group that trained me does a 1-week intensive. They're in the Bay Area, and they're called Voice of Witness. And they have a free book that is called Amplifying Unheard Stories, something like that. Look for a red cover. It's digital and free. The paper-based one, you'd pay and they'd ship it to you, but the digital one, same content. And it talks you through creating a project as well as how to start developing your first story prompt questions. The second resource that I really recommend, I don't, like after we're off the stage, I'm gonna look for it because I have saved it in my favorites in my phone. It's something like, it's a website that holds 50 questions that are life story prompt questions. So not necessarily oral history questions that are tied to a historical era or time period, but really trying to elicit a person's life story so that they feel honored and are honored, and also those stories don't go away.
That's a wonderful place to end, I think. And thank you so much for sharing your stories with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.